Hi, my name is Emily Talbot, and I'm the Chief Curator of the Norton Simon Museum. Today I'm joined by two esteemed colleagues from the Art Institute of Chicago, Kim Muir, Research Conservator for Paintings in the Department of Conservation and Science, and Gloria Groom, Chair of European Painting and Sculpture, and David and Mary Winton Green Curator in the Department of European Painting and Sculpture. We're speaking today to discuss two wonderful paintings by the 19th century French artist Edouard Manet in the Art Institute's collection, which are currently on loan to the Norton Simon Museum. Beggar with Oysters and Beggar with a Duffel Coat, both subtitled Philosopher and painted between 1865 and 1867. They are installed alongside the closely related painting in the Norton Simon's collection, The Rag Picker, where they're being exhibited together for the first time in 55 years. Gloria and Kim, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
Well, maybe we should start by just looking closely at the two Beggar paintings and discussing what they represent and how they fit into Manet's career at this moment.
Yeah, I think it's interesting at the Art Institute that we have these two paintings that have been so closely related throughout even Manet's life, and then their first owner, he had the two of them, and then they both ended up in the Art Institute, but from different trajectories. One came in 1910, and the other came in 1931. So they look like they've always been a pair, but they were separated at one point. Until Kim undertook the treatment, we couldn't really read them as well as we can now.
And so Beggar with Oysters, what's going on in that painting?
I love this painting because it's so, I like both of them, but the still life of the oysters is so Manet. He is just doing something so extraordinarily different at this moment, and he's so experimental, and it's the oysters that gives it away that it's a Manet because they're lush and they're very few strokes of paint, and they just give you this sense of these opened oysters. And for me, it's a more Manet painting than the Man with the Duffel Coat.
So in 2017, you all published Manet Paintings and Works on Paper at the Art Institute of Chicago, which I think is the sixth volume in your online series on Impressionism and Post-Impressionism.
Yeah. The online scholarly catalog, we bring in the technical information so that we're writing the entry, for example, on a painting, but it's not just about the art historical, it's about the methodology and the technique as well. It was a way to blend science and straight art history.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to invite Kim to join the conversation, and maybe we can hear a little bit about the publication and what you learned about the Philosophers series in particular.
Yeah, as research conservator at the Art Institute, my work focuses mostly on technical examinations of paintings in the collection. And as Gloria mentioned, we've been working very closely on our Impressionist collection for these digital catalogs, doing in-depth examinations and technical imaging to see what we can learn about the materials and the technique that Manet used. Each of the paintings at the Art Institute by Manet were brought up to the conservation department so that we could do complete technical examination and analysis of each work. And while we have the works up in conservation, we meet with Gloria and her curatorial team to discuss what we're finding, what the questions are. Although many of these works have been in the Art Institute's collection for some years, they haven't been subjected to this kind of in-depth examination. So we learned many new things. One of the advantages of being able to present this information online is that we can include much more of the technical information than we ever could in a print catalog. So in the catalog, we have high-resolution images that you can zoom in to see incredible detail. And we also have an interactive overlay tool where we can layer the different technical images, X-rays, infrared images, images of the painting under ultraviolet light. And the user can sort of scroll back and forth between these images and look, as we did, at the process of the artist and what is happening beneath the surface of the painting. One of the techniques that we use quite often in conservation is to take an X-ray of the painting. We're able to see sort of right through the thickness of the painting and all the layers that it's composed of. One of the things that the X-ray is particularly useful for is seeing changes made in the composition in the process of painting. So something that we call pentimenti, where the artist sort of changed his mind in the process. And we see a number of really sort of significant changes in the X-ray of the beggar with the duffel coat. And first of all, if we just look at the face, I think it's quite clear that when Manet originally painted the face, it was slightly slimmer. The beard was different. It was sort of more pointed beard. It didn't have sort of the furry side whiskers in the finished painting. The eyes look a little bit different. They seem a little bit sort of more expressive, maybe a little bit more open. So it seems clear from the X-ray that when Manet started this painting, he was painting quite a different figure, and then at some point painted over some of these details. Other changes that we see are in the sort of posture of the hands of the beggar. The lower one, which is sort of pointing down to the ground, you can see is very dense in the X-ray. And so this is related to a very thick buildup of paint, which contains a lot of lead white pigment. But it also is showing us that some changes were made there, and that's probably the reason why the paint is so thick here. When Manet first painted the hand, I think you can see that the fingers were sort of in a more curled up position. And then he reworked this hand with the palm sort of open and the fingers pointing downwards.
I was really interested in your description of the paint handling in each of those hands, too, on the surface, because I think you described the proper left hand that's held to the chest as having more impressionistic brushwork, and then the proper right being slightly more finely finished. Does that relate to your thinking about the timeline in which the painting was produced?
It's an interesting observation, the different paint handling in the hands. The lower hand is much more sort of modeled and articulated. It's been pointed out that the nails are finely painted and we're seeing shadows, which is sort of in contrast to the other hand where we're seeing much more Manet's kind of loose brushwork. The colors are not very blended. You're seeing individual strokes of paint, and that the hand is just a little bit sort of less refined. So this kind of difference in the paint handling could, in fact, be a function of him having painted these hands at different periods. I think one of the fascinating things about Manet and doing technical exams of his works is that you can see so much of his thought process right there on the canvas. He wasn't working a lot with sort of preparatory drawings the way that some artists might have, but through these different imaging techniques, you can see a lot of his actual manual process, especially when we look at the edges of works. So, for example, this is a detail of the X-ray of the beggar with the duffel coat. And what you can see is the nails that are currently attaching the canvas to the stretcher. But if you look just below that, in the slightly more dense area in the bottom 2/3, you can see that there are several dark spots along the top of the original canvas, which are actually pinholes. And this gives us some information about the way that Manet was working, and it suggests that he was possibly pinning up his canvases to work on them. So instead of working on a stretched canvas, pinning them to a board or a wall and working directly against that flat surface. His process is very physical. Often he's scraping away layers of paint as he's making changes. And I think working on a solid surface would have sort of enabled him to work that way a little bit better than working on a springy, stretched canvas.
I read in your catalog that the canvases of the two beggar paintings are not the same weave. So in our attempts to make them pendants, it seems like the material evidence is against us.
Yep, that's right. The thread counts for the two canvases are similar, but they're not exactly the same. So it suggests that the works weren't sort of conceived as pendant works, that he was painting them at the same time. They're definitely coming from two different sources.
You mentioned that the titles had perhaps changed around the time of the online catalog. Did you all come up with something slightly different on the tail end of your research?
I think we'd never really put together the different titles that they've been known under, that Manet himself called these two, including the Norton Simon, just Philosophers, but that it was actually the dealer who bought them in 1872 who gave them more specific titles. And then the photographer, after Manet's death, then they were given even more specific titles. So they're kind of open-ended. And so titles, I'm not sure about Manet's titles, if he really cared that much.
I think we've had some of those issues with historiography on the ragpicker too, because it's sometimes called beggar, even though a ragpicker and a beggar are very different subject matter.
When they're photographed, they're beggars because that's an easier concept to understand, but it's like those were understandable characters in Paris at the time.
I think people in the past have speculated that when the ragpicker has been described as a beggar, it's because that's a designation that makes more sense in English, and the French term chiffonnier is not as familiar. Even in the 19th century, I don't think it was as familiar to a British audience who was seeing the paintings when they were exhibited there in 1872. But for my purposes, it's been, in a way, the ragpicker has made my job easy because he has these recognizable attributes of the sack and the staff and the little still life in the foreground that's suggesting he's about to rummage through and salvage something for use later on. Whereas I think the beggar with a duffel coat and the beggar with oysters, there's something much more ambiguous about them. The beggar with a duffel coat has no still life element, so we're just left with this acknowledgement of us by this gesture of reaching out and facing us directly. And then the beggar with oysters, there's such an ambiguity to his facial expression, that sort of faraway look and that refusal to really look us in the eye and acknowledge us. Well, Gloria, can I just ask one question about the last years of Manet's life and sort of where he goes from here?
Oh, absolutely. I'm thinking of the portrait of Antonin Proust, where he's going back to a more conservative way of portraying someone. He's freed in some way towards the end of his life. He's no longer trying to do this or that. He is Manet, and he's doing Manet. And I think that the technique, the palette, everything has so radically changed by that time. And that's what I love about him. In a very short lifetime, he has broken so many rules. I mean, you saw the woman with the black fichu. That looks like it was done in one go. It was breathed onto the canvas. It's very, very lightly painted, very sketchy, very leaving parts of the canvas to show through. Her hands are almost not there. They're just an idea. Let's just make 3 strokes and there it is. And so I just think that to go from 1860s to the 1880s to the early 1880s is pretty exciting career. I mean, he does not stay in one place very long. Wonderful.
Well, I want to thank Gloria and Kim so much for joining us today and telling us a little bit about their extensive work on Manet. We are so delighted to have the 2 beggar paintings at the Norton Simon. Thank you for sharing them with us.
Can't wait to see them all together again.